Hello and welcome back. Settle in, get comfortable, and stay with me until the very last word, because today's question is one that quietly breaks hearts on both sides of a relationship, and almost nobody talks about it honestly. Who actually suffers more during no contact, the anxious person or the avoidant person? And why does this single question create so much confusion, so much pain, so much heartbreak for anyone caught inside this dynamic? When an anxious person and an avoidant person stop speaking to each other, the silence does not affect them the same way, even though both of them are often hurting far more than either one is willing to admit out loud. The anxious partner usually feels the pain almost immediately because their entire emotional world is built around closeness, reassurance, and steady communication. When the messages suddenly stop, the anxious mind starts frantically searching for answers. It replays old conversations on a loop, picks apart every word, every tone, every pause, trying to figure out exactly what went wrong. Every single hour of silence can feel like an entire day because uncertainty is often the hardest thing in the world for an anxious person to sit with quietly. They might check their phone constantly, hoping for a notification that never comes. They might revisit old photos, old voice notes, old memories, replaying them like a film they cannot stop watching. They quietly hope, against all logic, that the avoidant partner will suddenly break the silence and reach out first. For the anxious person, no contact often feels like a kind of emotional withdrawal, almost physical in nature, because they were so deeply used to finding comfort and regulation through connection itself. As a result, the very first stage of no contact usually feels overwhelming, almost unbearable, like the ground has quietly disappeared from beneath their feet. Meanwhile, the avoidant partner often reacts in an entirely different way during those same early days of separation. At first, no contact can genuinely feel like relief to them because the pressure, the expectations, the emotional intensity they were quietly carrying suddenly lifts. The avoidant person may convince themselves that they simply needed space, that distance is the obvious solution to all their internal discomfort. They often throw themselves into work, into hobbies, into rigid routines, into anything that keeps their mind busy and their feelings at a safe distance. To an outside observer, and even sometimes to the anxious partner watching from afar, it can genuinely look like the avoidant person has moved on without any real difficulty at all. This is exactly why so many anxious partners eventually convince themselves that the avoidant person never truly cared in the first place. But what is visible on the surface is rarely the full truth of what is happening underneath. People with avoidant tendencies are often quiet experts at suppressing emotion, especially when that emotion starts to feel overwhelming, threatening, or simply too big to hold. Instead of processing pain in real time, they tend to place emotional experiences into neat mental boxes, sealing them shut and trying with everything in them not to think about what is inside. This coping strategy can create a very convincing illusion, both to others and to themselves, that they are completely unaffected by the breakup or the separation. But emotions that get buried this way are not emotions that simply disappear. They wait. Quietly, patiently, somewhere just beneath the surface. The anxious person feels everything right now, in real time, often all at once. The avoidant person often feels everything later, sometimes much later, once the noise and distraction finally settle. This is one of the most important differences between these two attachment patterns during a stretch of no contact. The anxious partner's suffering tends to be intense, immediate, and almost impossible to hide or ignore. The avoidant partner's suffering, on the other hand, is usually delayed, hidden, and genuinely difficult even for them to recognize within themselves at first. During those first few weeks, the anxious person may honestly believe they are losing some invisible battle, simply because they are hurting so visibly and so deeply. They might wonder, with real confusion, why they cannot stop thinking about someone who appears to be doing perfectly fine without them. But emotional pain was never accurately measured by what shows up on the outside. Many avoidant people spend those early weeks convincing themselves they are genuinely happier alone, that they are better off without the weight of emotional dependence. Yet as time slowly, quietly passes, reality begins gently replacing distraction. The daily routines that once kept them so effectively busy start to feel ordinary again, no longer offering that same escape they once provided. The silence that initially felt peaceful starts to feel strangely, uncomfortably empty in a way they did not expect. The absence of the anxious partner becomes harder and harder to ignore because the emotional connection they once leaned on, even without fully realizing it, simply is not there anymore to soften the edges of their day. This is often the exact point when avoidant people begin remembering the genuinely good parts of the relationship. Instead of fixating on the pressure or the conflict that once felt suffocating, they start recalling the laughter, the small inside jokes, the quiet support, the affection, the easy companionship that made ordinary days feel a little warmer. The memories they once pushed firmly away begin quietly resurfacing on their own, uninvited but persistent. At this stage, many avoidant individuals start experiencing feelings they genuinely believed they had already escaped for good. Regret creeps in. Loneliness settles in the chest. A quiet curiosity about the other person's life begins to grow. And underneath all of it, a kind of longing emerges, one that only seems to surface once the emotional threat feels far enough away to be safe to feel. Meanwhile, the anxious partner may already be stepping into a completely different stage of their own healing. After weeks of heartbreak, many anxious individuals slowly begin accepting the reality of the separation, even if it still aches. They start redirecting their energy back toward themselves, their own goals, their own growth, their own life outside of the relationship. The pain has not vanished entirely, but it gradually becomes more manageable, less consuming, easier to carry through an ordinary day. They begin learning, often for the very first time, that survival really is possible, even without the constant reassurance they once felt they could not live without. And ironically, this is often the exact moment when the avoidant person finally begins to feel the true, full weight of the loss. The timing of it all creates a strange, almost cruel kind of mismatch, because both people are moving through entirely different emotional stages at entirely different points in time. The anxious person suffers first and heals later. The avoidant person escapes first and suffers later. Neither experience is easy in any sense, but the timing alone makes the two journeys look almost like complete opposites from the outside looking in. Another reason this whole question is so difficult to answer cleanly is because suffering itself shows up in so many different forms. The anxious person tends to suffer through a fear of abandonment and a kind of constant gnawing uncertainty. Their pain is usually emotional, visible, and often expressed quite openly, whether through tears, through long messages they never send, or through conversations with friends trying to make sense of what happened. The avoidant person tends to suffer through emotional suppression and a quiet internal disconnection instead. Their pain stays hidden beneath layers of independence, busyness, and careful self-protection, often invisible even to the people closest to them. One person cries because they feel everything too intensely to hold it in. The other person disconnects almost entirely because feeling that much genuinely frightens them. Both of them are responding to real, legitimate pain, but their coping mechanisms could hardly look more different from one another on the surface. The anxious individual often seeks closeness the very moment they start to hurt. The avoidant individual often seeks distance the very moment they start to hurt. Because of this fundamental difference, their behaviors get misread constantly by each other and by everyone watching from the outside. The anxious partner sees distance from the other side and quietly assumes there must be no real pain behind it at all. The avoidant partner sees open emotional expression and assumes there must be far too much pain to safely engage with. Both of these interpretations, more often than not, turn out to be inaccurate. Deep down, both attachment styles are usually reacting to the very same underlying fear, the fear of losing someone who genuinely matters to them. The real difference was never about whether the pain exists, it is only about how that pain gets managed, hidden, expressed, or quietly carried. Many people ask whether no contact actually hurts the avoidant person at all, given how calm, composed, and unaffected they often appear from the outside. The honest answer is that it usually does hurt them, just rarely in the way most people expect or hope to see. Avoidant individuals may not spend every single day crying, refreshing their messages, or openly grieving the way an anxious person often does. Instead, their pain tends to show up quietly, as emotional numbness, as an unexplained restlessness, as a creeping loneliness they cannot quite name, or as a slowly growing sense that something meaningful is missing from their otherwise ordinary days. Because these feelings emerge so gradually, almost like a slow leak rather than a sudden flood, they are far easier to overlook, even by the avoidant person themselves, who may genuinely believe they are simply fine. Some avoidant individuals do eventually reach out, not out of some dramatic realization, but simply because the absence becomes harder and harder to ignore than the original closeness ever was. Others continue suppressing those emotions indefinitely, sometimes for years, never fully processing the loss at all. Whether someone falls into one outcome or the other depends largely on their level of self-awareness and their overall emotional maturity at that particular point in their life. The very same pattern holds true for anxious individuals as well. Some people use the stretch of no contact as a genuine turning point, an opportunity to finally heal and slowly build healthier emotional habits going forward. They start therapy, start journaling, start learning the difference between love and anxiety, start building a relationship with themselves that does not depend on someone else's text message to feel whole. Others remain stuck in a quiet loop of hope, endlessly waiting for a message that may never actually arrive, putting their healing on hold indefinitely while life passes by around them. The eventual outcome here depends far less on attachment style alone and far more on each person's genuine willingness to grow, to look inward, and to take responsibility for their own emotional patterns rather than waiting for the other person to change first. So, who actually suffers more during no contact? The anxious person or the avoidant person? The most honest, most complete answer is that both of them suffer, simply in different ways and at entirely different points in time. The anxious person typically experiences intense, sharp pain right at the very beginning of the separation, when the silence is still fresh and loud. The avoidant person typically experiences a quieter, delayed pain that only surfaces once the distance becomes undeniably real to them, once the distractions stop working and the silence settles into something permanent. One person feels the full storm immediately, right from the very first day. The other person feels that same storm much later, often right after quietly believing it had already safely passed them by, only to be caught off guard by it weeks or even months down the line. Understanding this simple but important difference can genuinely help you stop comparing your own healing journey to someone else's outward behavior. Just because someone appears completely unaffected on the surface, posting normally, going about their routine, seeming perfectly fine to everyone watching, does not mean they are not quietly struggling somewhere underneath it all. And just because you happen to be hurting deeply today, crying more than you would like to admit, checking your phone more than you should, does not mean you will feel this way forever. Pain like this moves in waves, not straight lines. And where you are today is not where you will remain. No contact in many ways reveals far more than just feelings for another person. It reveals exactly how each person individually handles fear, loss, vulnerability, and emotional connection at their core. It strips away the distractions of daily conversation and leaves both people alone with themselves, often for the first time in a long while, forced to sit with whatever comes up in that quiet. For some, that quiet becomes unbearable almost instantly. For others, that same quiet does not fully arrive until much later, sneaking up on them when they least expect it. The real goal here was never about making someone else suffer, or about trying to prove who misses whom more in the end. That kind of thinking only keeps both people trapped in a painful, invisible competition that nobody actually wins. The true purpose of this entire process, as difficult and unfair as it can feel in the moment, is to heal. to grow, and to slowly build a stronger, steadier relationship with yourself, one that does not depend on anyone else's timeline, reaction, or eventual return. Because at the very end of it all, the person who truly wins during no contact was never the one who simply suffered less along the way. The person who wins is the one who learns from the experience, who allows themselves to fully heal rather than just distract themselves from the pain, and who becomes emotionally stronger because of everything they went through, not in spite of it. If you have ever found yourself on either side of this story, the anxious heart quietly waiting by the phone, replaying every conversation, or the avoidant heart, slowly realizing what silence really feels like once the distractions run out, please know that healing was never meant to follow a perfect timeline. Some days you will feel strong and steady, fully convinced you have moved past it. Other days, the old ache will return out of nowhere, uninvited, and that does not mean you have failed or gone backward. That is simply part of being human, part of untangling yourself from something that once meant a great deal to you. What matters most is not how quickly you heal, or how composed you appear to others while doing it. What matters is that you keep gently, consistently choosing yourself, even on the days when that feels like the hardest thing in the world to do. There is also a quieter truth hiding inside all of this, one that rarely gets talked about. The amount of suffering someone experiences during no contact is not actually a measurement of how much they loved the other person. An anxious person is not more devoted simply because their pain is louder and more visible. An avoidant person is not less invested simply because their pain takes longer to surface. Love is not a contest measured in tears, in sleepless nights, or in who breaks first and reaches out. It is something far more private than that, something that does not always show up on schedule, and something that often looks completely different from one person to the next, even when the depth of feeling is genuinely similar. It also helps to remember that attachment styles are not fixed identities carved in stone. They are patterns learned early in life, often shaped by the relationships we had with caregivers long before we ever met the person we are now grieving. An anxious pattern develops from a history where love felt inconsistent, where closeness had to be earned or chased. An avoidant pattern develops from a history where emotional needs were dismissed or unmet, where independence became the only safe option. Neither pattern was chosen on purpose. Both were simply survival strategies that once made sense for a smaller, more vulnerable version of each person. Understanding this does not excuse painful behavior, but it can soften the way you see both yourself and the person you are grieving, including the part of you that kept checking your phone, and the part of them that kept pulling away. If you currently find yourself in the anxious role, gently remind yourself that the intensity of your pain is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It simply means you are someone who feels deeply, who connects fully, and who is now learning how to hold that depth without losing yourself in someone else's silence. And if you recognize the avoidant pattern in yourself instead, know that numbness is not the same thing as not caring. It may simply mean you never learned a safer way to feel big emotions without retreating from them entirely. Growth, for both sides, usually begins the same way, by finally getting curious about your own patterns instead of only studying the other person's. There is one more thing worth sitting with before we close. So much of the pain in no contact comes from waiting for the other person to prove something, to send a sign, to validate the love you already know was real. But the truth is, you do not actually need their timeline to confirm your worth, and you do not need their eventual longing to make sense of what you already lived through. Whether they reach out tomorrow or never reach out at all, your healing does not have to wait on their decision. The version of you on the other side of this, the one who learns to sit with silence without falling apart, the one who stops measuring love by how much it hurts, that version of you is already being built right now, in this exact uncomfortable stretch of time you are trying to survive. If you are the anxious one listening to this, let today be the day you stop interpreting their silence as the final word on your value. Their distance was never proof that you were too much. It was simply proof of where they currently are in their own emotional capacity, which is something you were never responsible for fixing. And if you are the avoidant one, let today be the day you stop waiting for numbness to feel like enough. Comfort built entirely on distance eventually turns into its own kind of loneliness, and you deserve more than a life spent quietly protecting yourself from the very closeness you actually crave. Healing from someone who could not stay present is rarely a straight road. There will be mornings when you wake up lighter than you expected, and there will be nights when a single song or a familiar street corner pulls you right back into the ache. Both of these things can be true at once, and neither one means you are doing it wrong. The work is not about erasing what happened. It is about slowly learning to carry it differently, until one day it stops feeling like a wound and starts feeling like simply a part of your story. If you take only one thing away from everything we have talked about today, let it be this. No contact is not a punishment, and it is not a game with a winner and a loser. It is simply space. The kind of space that finally lets both people stop performing for each other and start being honest with themselves. For the anxious person, that space eventually becomes proof that you can survive uncertainty without falling apart, that your peace does not have to depend on someone else's reply. For the avoidant person, that same space eventually becomes a mirror, showing them exactly what their distance was protecting them from, and exactly what it cost them in the end. Neither lesson arrives quickly, and neither one feels fair while you are living through it. But both lessons, in their own time, tend to lead somewhere worth arriving at. So wherever you are tonight, whether you are the one refreshing your phone, or the one who finally stopped reaching for it, give yourself permission to stop ranking your pain against someone else's silence. Healing was never a race between two people. It was always just you, slowly coming home to yourself, one quiet day at a time. And if no one has told you this yet today, you are doing better than you think you are. Surviving the silence, sitting with the discomfort instead of numbing it away, choosing to keep showing up for your own life even when your heart feels heavy, that is not weakness. That is quiet, steady courage, the kind that rarely gets applauded, but always gets noticed by the version of you waiting patiently on the other side of this. The version who finally feels whole without needing anyone else's silence to explain. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If this gave you even a little clarity or made you feel a little less alone in whatever you are quietly carrying right now, that means more than you know. Take care of your heart, be patient with your own healing, and I will see you again in the next one.